All right, let's dive into one of the most wild, violent, and just plain contradictory stories of the 20th century, the life of Pablo Escobar. This is a guy who was seen as a hero by some, an absolute demon by others, and for a terrifying time in history, he basically held an entire country hostage. But this story, it's about so much more than just drugs. It's really about power, paradox, and what happens when one man's criminal empire becomes more powerful, more organized, and for some people, even more trusted than the government itself.
No, really. I want you to think about that for a second. I'm not talking about just being rich. I mean having a fortune so massive, so physically huge, that it just breaks the whole idea of money. You can't spend it fast enough, no bank on earth will take it, you can't even count it. It stops being a benefit and becomes a problem, a huge physical burden. This was the completely bizarre reality of Pablo Escobar's world, a level of excess that, honestly, is almost impossible to wrap your head around.
And this number says it all. $2 billion. Not lost in bad stock picks, not seized by the cops. This was money that was just lost, spoiled. It was cash stuffed into barrels and buried in farmers' fields, hidden in the walls of old warehouses where it would literally rot in the damp air or get eaten by rats. For the Medellin cartel, this wasn't even a catastrophe. It was just a line item on their budget, an accepted cost of doing business. It's just insane.
And you have to understand, his power wasn't just about the money. It was absolute. I mean, when the Colombian government, after a long and bloody fight, finally had him cornered, you know what he did? He dictated the terms of his own surrender. He didn't go to some state-run prison. Oh no. He designed and built his own personal fortress, a luxury resort he called La Catedral that overlooked his city. This wasn't prison. It was a strategic move, a palace where he could keep running his empire just to prove to everyone that he was still the one in charge.
So the big question is, how on earth does one man get that much power? To really understand the monster he became, you've got to look at where he came from, because it didn't start with private jets and billions of dollars. It all started on the streets of Medellin, with a kid born into poverty who had a ton of ambition and a uniquely ruthless grasp of how markets work. Yeah, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria wasn't born some kind of kingpin. He started out with petty street hustles, stealing cars, running little scams. One of his early gigs, and this is pretty morbid, was stealing tombstones from cemeteries, sanding off the names and reselling them. He was a small-time crook, but he had a mind that saw the bigger picture. In the 70s, he saw this growing demand for a new drug in the US, cocaine. And more importantly, he saw the insane profit margins. We're talking a kilo that cost maybe $1,000 to make in the jungle could sell for $70,000 in Miami. So he didn't just get into the business. He decided he was going to industrialize it. He brought all these different traffickers together and created a powerhouse, the Medellin cartel. So how did he scale up so fast, so effectively? Well, he came up with this brutal, terrifyingly simple policy that would define Colombia for a generation. Plata o Plomo. Silver or lead. It was the choice he gave everyone who stood in his way, from the cop on the beat to judges and powerful politicians. Just put yourself in their shoes for a second. Think about that choice. You can take the plata, the silver, the bribe, and your family is set for life. You just have to look the other way. Or you can take the plomo, the lead, a bullet. And it wasn't just a threat to you, it was often a threat to your entire family. This chilling philosophy was how he dismantled the government's power from the inside out. Faced with that choice, what would you do? Most people took the silver, and the brave ones who didn't, they often didn't even make it home. So with anyone who could stop him either paid off or 6 feet under, the floodgates just burst open. The late 70s and early 80s, that was the peak of the Medellin cartel. We're about to get into some numbers that are so staggering, so unbelievable, they honestly start to sound like they're made up. But believe me, they were very, very real.
Just try to picture that for a second. 15 tons. That's like the weight of 2 full-grown elephants, shipped into the US every single day. The logistics behind it were frankly brilliant in a completely evil way. They had their own fleet of planes, they built their own submarines, they even bought whole islands in the Bahamas just for refueling stops. It was a massive operation, a seamless supply chain from the mountains of Colombia right to the streets of America.
And here's the other side of that coin, and it's almost funny if it weren't so insane.
All that cocaine meant a literal mountain of incoming cash. We're talking mostly small bills, too, 10s and 20s. The volume was so huge, they were spending $2,500 a month on a rubber bands just to wrap the money. It's such a tiny, ridiculous detail, but it tells you everything you need to know about the scale of the operation. At one point, Forbes magazine officially named him the 7th richest man on the entire planet, with a fortune over $25 billion. But here's the thing, he couldn't just deposit it. No bank in the world could handle that much dirty cash. So what did he do? He became a modern-day pirate and buried his treasure. They'd stuff millions of dollars into barrels and bury them all over the country, which of course brings us right back to that $2 billion rot problem we talked about earlier. And this is where we get to the real heart of the Pablo Escobar paradox. While he was this ruthless criminal, he was also playing a completely different game back home. In his city, Medellin, which was mostly ignored by the government, he became a kind of savior. He built entire neighborhoods for people who were literally living in garbage dumps. He built soccer fields for the local kids. He'd drive through the slums just handing out wads of cash. So to the rest of the world, he's a narco-terrorist. But to the poorest people of his city, he was el Patrón. He was their Robin Hood. And make no mistake, this wasn't just charity. It was a strategy. He was buying their loyalty. And in doing so, he was building a human shield. But, ego is a powerful thing. Escobar didn't just want to be a rich criminal. He wanted respect. He wanted legitimacy. He actually wanted to be the president of Colombia. And it was that ambition that led to his biggest mistake. It pushed him into an all-out war with the state, all because of the one thing he feared more than anything else, being extradited to the US. So in 1982, he actually pulled it off. He used his drug money to get himself elected to Congress. But a very brave justice minister named Rodrigo Lara Bonilla exposed him for what he was, and he was publicly humiliated and kicked out. Escobar's revenge was swift. He had Bonilla assassinated, and that single act was a declaration of war. It forced the government, with a lot of pressure from the US, to create an extradition treaty. For Escobar, a US prison was worse than death, and he was ready to burn his whole country down to avoid it. His war against the state became shockingly brutal. He started putting bounties on police officers. He set off massive car bombs in public spaces. But the absolute darkest moment, the thing that completely destroyed any claim he had to being a Robin Hood, was when he bombed a commercial airliner, Avianca Flight 203. He did it to kill a single politician he thought was on board. 107 innocent people, men, women, and children, died that day. And the politician he was trying to kill? He wasn't even on the plane. Now here's the crazy part. His campaign of terror? It actually worked. The government was so overwhelmed by the violence that they finally broke. In 1991, they basically surrendered. They rewrote their constitution to ban extradition, and in return, Escobar agreed to go to prison. But, as you're about to see, this wasn't the end of his reign. It was just the next chapter, a ceasefire, completely on his own terms. Right, so he built his own prison, La Catedral, this luxury compound on a mountain overlooking his city. I mean, look at this list. A jacuzzi, a private disco. The guards were guys he hired himself. This was not a prison. He had a telescope so he could look down at his daughter's house. He was still running the entire cartel from inside. And he even continued his violence there, torturing and murdering his own men right inside the prison walls. Well, eventually, word got out about the murders happening inside La Catedral, and it was a huge embarrassment for the government. They couldn't ignore it anymore. So they sent the army to transfer him to a real prison. But Escobar, he was always one step ahead. Before they could even get to him, he just walked out the back gate and disappeared into the fog. The king was free again, and one of the largest manhunts in history was officially on. And this time, it was different. The gloves were off. Everybody was after him. You had the search block, an elite Colombian police unit trained by the US. You had the DEA feeding them intel. You even had American Special Forces on the ground advising. And then a new player entered the game, a shadowy group called Los Pepes. It stood for People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar. This was a vigilante death squad, funded by his rivals, and they were just as brutal as he was. They didn't make arrests, they just started killing his lawyers, his accountants, his hitmen, fighting fire with an even bigger fire. Pablo was trapped. Los Pepes were systematically destroying his empire. He was running out of money, out of friends, out of places to hide. The billionaire king was now a paranoid fugitive hiding out in average suburban houses, looking like a ghost of his former self. And then on December 2nd, 1993, the day after his 44th birthday, he made a very simple, very human mistake. He was desperate to talk to his family, and he forgot the #1 rule of being on the run.
He stayed on the phone too long, long enough for American and Colombian intelligence to triangulate his position. The search block stormed the house, and the man who once basically owned a country was found barefoot scrambling across a rooftop. Gunshots rang out, and just like that, the king of cocaine was dead. But his death, well, it didn't really end the story. It just started the real debate over his complicated, bloody, and deeply divided legacy. And this right here, this visualizes that division perfectly. On the one hand, you have the victims. He was responsible for the deaths of around 4,000 people. Judges, police, journalists, civilians. On the other hand, look at this. 25,000 people came to his funeral. They flooded the streets, weeping for him, carrying his coffin like he was a fallen hero. And that contradiction is still alive and well today. If you go to the neighborhoods he built in Medellin, you can still find murals of his face. People light candles for him in their homes. To them, he was the guy who gave them a home and some dignity when their own government gave them nothing. But you talk to the thousands of families he tore apart with his bombs and bullets, and to them, he is and always will be a demon. There's no middle ground here, no agreement.
In the end, what Pablo Escobar really left behind was a whole lot of questions. He proved that a single criminal could become so powerful he could wage war on an entire country and almost win. But his story also proves that no matter how much money you have, no matter how high you build your walls, you can't hide forever. So I'll leave you with this to think about. What's his true legacy? Is he a cautionary tale, a strange kind of folk hero, or something else entirely? The answer, just like the man himself, is one heck of a paradox.